They stormed into the store, tearing through shelves, knocking over displays, acting as if they had caught a criminal in the act. The officers barked orders, shoving aside customers, their eyes filled with arrogance and unchecked authority. But they had no idea the woman they were intimidating wasn't just a store owner. She was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. With a calm but commanding presence, she watched their reckless abuse of power, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal the truth. When she finally spoke, their smug confidence shattered, replaced with pure panic. Justice was about to be served, but not in the way they expected. If you want to see more powerful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and like our YouTube channel. The boutique was a sanctuary of sophistication, but the peace shattered as the door burst open. 5 police officers, led by Detective Connor Hayes, stormed in with self-righteous determination. Shoppers froze, and Maya dropped a stack of clothes. Hayes announced their intent to search the store, ignoring Vivian's demand for a warrant. Officers began rifling through racks, knocking over displays. One officer, Jenkins, hesitated, uneasy but compliant. Maya objected, but an officer shoved her back. Customers backed away, some taking out their phones. Hayes dismissed Vivian's protests, claiming fraudulent transactions and counterfeit goods. She remained poised, gripping her teacup tightly. Outside, a crowd gathered. Terrell Grayson, a local activist, began live-streaming the event, condemning the officer's actions. He stepped closer, his voice rising. Inside, Maya urged Vivian to act. Vivian eyed her phone, but Hayes snatched it away. He assumed she was just another shop owner caught in bad business. Vivian, calm yet firm, revealed her true identity, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Silence engulfed the store. Officers froze. Jenkins paled. Even Maya smirked. Hayes blinked, momentarily uncertain. Panic crept into the officers' expressions. Terrell's live feed exploded with comments. The power dynamic shifted. Officers exchanged nervous glances. Hayes clenched his jaw, unwilling to back down, but he knew they had overstepped. He ordered a retreat. The officers scrambled to leave, knocking over more displays in their haste. As Hayes stormed past Vivian, she smirked, reminding him to do his homework next time. Outside, Terrell grinned at his phone as the internet erupted with reactions. The tables had turned, and the world was watching. Vivian sat back, her fingers lightly tapping against the counter as the store fell into disarray. Maya shook her head, frustration evident in her stance. The remaining customers murmured among themselves, some exiting, others sticking around to witness what came next. Vivian's mind was already working through the legal avenues she would pursue. She had dealt with abuses of power before, but to have her own establishment attacked like this was a new level of audacity. She would not let it slide. Meanwhile, Hayes and his officers reconvened in a nearby patrol car, their tension palpable. He gritted his teeth, furious at himself for not recognizing who he had confronted. One of the officers muttered that they should have checked first, but Hayes waved him off, knowing full well they had just walked into a career-ending mistake. His mind raced with ways to control the damage, but deep down, he knew the battle was already lost. He was about to become the next headline. Back at the boutique, Terrell continued his stream, urging viewers to demand justice. The internet had already begun mobilizing. Hashtags formed. Calls to action spread. The event was no longer just about one store, it was about the deeper issues embedded in the system. Vivian watched as notifications flooded her phone, legal colleagues and media outlets reaching out. She took a breath, preparing for what was to come. This was no longer just about her store. This was a reckoning. The night after the raid, Detective Hayes sat in his dimly lit office, his fingers twitching against his desk. The news cycle had already torn into him, flashing headlines questioning his conduct. Every major news outlet had a panel dissecting his actions, with legal experts condemning the blatant abuse of power. His phone buzzed, a message from his superior. One word, damage. He knew what that meant. He had to regain control of the situation before it spiraled further. His mind ran through options, but the reality was sinking and he had crossed the wrong person. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was not someone he could simply muscle through. At that moment, an urgent knock rattled his door. Officer Jenkins, still shaken from earlier, stepped inside. His face was pale, his hands unsteady. He hesitated before speaking. "We might have a problem." Jenkins explained that one of the officers from the raid had gone rogue, trying to leak inside department reports to the press. Hayes felt the walls closing in, his reputation crumbling. He needed to act fast, but every move now felt like a losing game. Meanwhile, across the city, Vivian Marshall sat at a sleek desk, scrolling through an endless flood of messages. Public outcry had reached an unprecedented level. Supporters flooded her inbox, but so did threats. There were those who still clung to their biases, who saw her authority as an affront. She knew what came next. The institution would try to salvage itself. They would try to make her go silent. She wouldn't. Maya paced the room, frustration in her voice as she listed the damage to the boutique. But Vivian's mind was elsewhere, focused on the bigger fight. She had seen abuse of power before, but this was personal. This was war. Back in Hayes's office, the detective was already working on countermeasures. He placed a call to an old contact, someone who specialized in making inconvenient stories disappear. But the answer he received was not what he wanted. "This one's too big. You're on your own." The door swung open again. This time, his superior stood there, face unreadable. "Pack your things, Connor. You're suspended pending investigation." Everything fell apart at once. At the same moment, in a downtown newsroom, Terrell Grayson sat in front of a monitor, reviewing the footage from the raid. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He had enough to keep this story alive for weeks. He had seen the tactics before, the sudden disappearance of stories, the shifting narratives, but this time was different. He had the public on his side. More than that, he had the truth. Outside, the city pulsed with energy. People gathered in protest, demanding justice, demanding accountability. The battle lines had been drawn, and neither side was backing down. Vivian stood at the window, watching the movement take shape. She had spent her life upholding the law, but now she realized some battles were won outside the courtroom. This was only the beginning. As the tension grew, Hayes found himself isolated. His former allies distanced themselves. An anonymous leak of internal memos suggested he had a pattern of targeting black-owned businesses. His badge, once a shield of power, now felt like a liability. Calls from unknown numbers filled his phone, some offering support, others making veiled threats. He knew he was becoming a scapegoat, but the bigger question was who was pulling the strings? Vivian, on the other hand, prepared for her next move. A special session was convened by the judiciary, and she was invited to speak. Her presence alone sent shockwaves through law enforcement circles. Behind closed doors, key figures debated damage control strategies. Some wanted to distance themselves from Hayes entirely, while others sought to double down, spinning the story in their favor. In a shadowy conference room, city officials, police representatives, and political figures debated their next step. Some pushed for internal reform, fearing the public's growing unrest. Others dismissed the concerns, chalking it up to social media hysteria. One figure, sitting quietly in the back, finally spoke. His voice was calm but firm. "If we let her dictate the conversation, we've already lost." Back in the newsroom, Terrell received a message from an anonymous source. A meeting was being arranged. Someone inside the department had information that could blow the case wide open. But there was a catch. The meeting place was secluded, the details deliberately vague. It felt like a trap, but the opportunity was too good to pass up. As the night deepened, tensions boiled over. Protests swelled into the thousands. Marches filled the streets, and news crews captured every moment. Meanwhile, Hayes found himself tailed by an unmarked vehicle. He wasn't sure if it was the department keeping tabs on him or something worse. Paranoia crept in. Vivian made her decision. She would address the people directly. In an unfiltered, unscripted live broadcast, she would lay out the facts, exposing the corruption at the core of the issue. Maya worked beside her, ensuring every word was precise, every statement airtight. As the sun rose, the city braced itself. This battle was far from over. Hayes barely had time to breathe. The morning air was thick with tension. His badge, once a symbol of authority, now felt like a target. Every call he received was either from a lawyer, a journalist, or someone reminding him that he was on borrowed time. The department had abandoned him. The mayor's office refused to acknowledge his existence. He was toxic. At headquarters, Jenkins sat in silence. His hands trembled as he stared at his untouched coffee. The guilt was unbearable. He had watched the raid unfold, had participated in it, and now the weight of his actions suffocated him. The department's higher-ups were in closed meetings, trying to salvage what they could. No one was talking to the officers on the ground. No one was asking what really happened. They only cared about damage control. Vivian Marshall, however, was moving forward. Her face had become the image of defiance. Every major news outlet wanted an interview, but she remained selective. This wasn't about spectacle, this was about change. Maya worked alongside her, gathering every piece of evidence, every recorded moment, preparing for what was to come. Terrell Grayson's investigation was reaching dangerous territory. His sources whispered of a deeper rot within the system. Officers who had been pushed out for refusing to go along with orders. Business owners who had been intimidated. He arranged another meeting, this time with someone who claimed to have undeniable proof. But trust was a dangerous currency now. He had to be careful. Hayes was being watched. He felt it. The paranoia settled into his bones, making him question every shadow. He had spent his career as the predator, but now he was the prey. He reached out to an old friend in the force, hoping for insight. The response was blunt: "You should leave town." Inside the judiciary, debates raged. Some wanted Vivian to step back, to de-escalate. Others saw her as the force that could finally shatter a corrupt system. The pressure was immense, but she stood unwavering. The Supreme Court was silent, their neutrality making them complicit. She would not be. The protests escalated. What had started as peaceful demonstrations were now met with riot gear. The police presence thickened, their stance more aggressive. Clashes erupted. The mayor's office called for calm while deploying more forces. The city was at a breaking point. In a dimly lit garage, Terrell met his source. The man was nervous, his voice shaking. He slid a flash drive across the table. "Everything you need is in here." Terrell didn't hesitate. He knew this was the key. As he stepped back into the night, he sensed he was being followed. Vivian prepared for her next move. She would not wait for justice to come. She would take it. Hayes knew he had only a small window left before everything came crashing down. His options were running out, and those who once stood beside him had now turned their backs. His calls were ignored. His messages left unanswered. Even those who had encouraged his aggressive tactics in the past had now disowned him. He wasn't just suspended, he was disposable. The weight of betrayal pressed against his chest, but he wasn't done yet. Jenkins wrestled with his conscience. He had seen too much, done too little, and now every decision clawed at his thoughts. He watched as officers around him spoke in hushed tones, their eyes shifting uncomfortably. The department was panicking. They had underestimated the storm. They had assumed this would be another forgotten case, a scandal that would fade into the news cycle. But Vivian Marshall was relentless, and the public was not looking away. Vivian was already planning her next move. Every meeting was strategic, every interview precise. She knew what they wanted: silence. She had no intention of giving it to them. Maya pushed harder, compiling every piece of footage, every testimony. This wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had been trampled under the weight of a system built to protect itself. Terrell worked deep into the night, analyzing the data from the flash drive. What he found was worse than he expected. It wasn't just corruption, it was systemic. Documents showed patterns of targeted raids, falsified reports, businesses deliberately shut down under the guise of law enforcement. And it wasn't just Hayes. There were names. High-ranking officials. Officers with long histories of misconduct. The scale of it was staggering. Meanwhile, in the mayor's office, damage control was in full effect. Statements were being drafted, public appearances were being prepared. The goal was clear: deflect and delay. If they could hold out long enough, the outrage would eventually dissipate. But this time, it wasn't slowing down. Every attempt to pivot the narrative failed. Every effort to shift the blame was met with backlash. Protests erupted into chaos. What had begun as peaceful demonstrations turned violent as riot police pushed back harder. Tear gas filled the streets. Arrests were made. But the more force they used, the more resistance grew. The city was slipping out of control, and those in power knew it. Hayes made a decision. If he was going down, he wasn't going down alone. He began gathering his own files, his own evidence. He had dirt on people far above him, people who had used him as their enforcer but now saw him as expendable. He just needed the right moment to use it. Terrell's investigation took a dangerous turn. The deeper he dug, the more doors began to close. His source had already gone silent. He noticed unfamiliar cars parked near his building, the feeling of being watched growing stronger. He knew he was getting close to something they didn't want him to find. Vivian received a message. A private, encrypted email from an anonymous sender. A warning. They're coming for you. She stared at the screen, knowing full well the weight of those words. She had faced threats before, but this was different. This was personal. The city was at a boiling point. Every piece was moving, every decision pushing closer to an inevitable confrontation. The system was fighting back, but this time, the people weren't backing down. Hayes sat in his car, hands gripping the wheel, sweat forming at his temples. Every move felt like it could be his last. The department had disavowed him, and the people who once used him had cut him loose. He wasn't just being watched, he was being hunted. He thought about disappearing, but where would he go? He had made too many enemies on both sides. He needed leverage, and he needed it fast. Jenkins hadn't slept. Every moment played over in his mind. The raid. The lies. The orders barked from above, followed without question. He stared at his phone, scrolling through messages from fellow officers, some justifying what had happened, others terrified of what was coming next. He wasn't the only one questioning everything, but no one was willing to take the first step. Fear held them all in place. Fear of retaliation, fear of exposure. Vivian sat at her desk, heart steady, gaze unwavering. Every attack against her had been anticipated. Every smear campaign, every veiled threat. She had fought tougher battles, but this one was different. This one was personal. They had underestimated her resolve, thinking pressure alone would force her out of the fight. They were wrong. She drafted her statement carefully, each word chosen with precision. There would be no retreat. Terrell's heart pounded as he drove. He had arranged a meeting with another informant, someone inside the system who had seen too much and finally decided to talk. But paranoia gripped him. His last source had vanished. This one might not even show up. He had taken precautions, changed routes, checked for tails. Yet, as he approached the meeting point, he felt it, that unshakable sense that someone was waiting for him. The city was reaching its breaking point. Protests had evolved into outright defiance. The police presence had escalated, riot gear replacing uniforms. The mayor's office had authorized harsher crackdowns, justifying it as public safety. But the harder they pushed, the stronger the resistance grew. The people weren't just protesting anymore. They were demanding justice, demanding accountability. And they weren't leaving. Inside a high-rise office, powerful figures sat in silence, watching the chaos unfold. Some wanted to pull back, to let things settle before more damage was done. Others saw it differently. This was a fire that needed to be stamped out before it spread further. They had contingencies. They had people willing to do whatever was necessary. The question was whether they were ready to cross that line. Hayes made his move. He reached out to an old connection, someone deep enough in the system to know what was coming. The response was swift and brutal. "Walk away. There's nothing left for you here." But Hayes wasn't the type to run. If he was going down, he was taking as many with him as possible. Terrell stepped out of his car, eyes scanning every shadow. The informant was already there, nervous, hands fidgeting. "They're cleaning house," the man whispered. "Anyone who knows too much is being erased. You need to be careful. They've got names, locations, backup plans. They've already made their next move." Vivian's phone buzzed. A new email. Wuledlo. A single line, "They're ready to take the gloves off." The city held its breath. The battle lines were drawn. The war was about to begin. Hayes knew he was out of time. Every contact had gone silent, every favor had dried up. He sat alone, gripping a burner phone, weighing his last options. He had spent years cleaning up other people's messes, enforcing their will, and now they had turned their backs on him. He wasn't just expendable, he was a liability. And he knew what happened to liabilities. He had to strike first. Jenkins had reached his breaking point. The weight of everything, his guilt, his fear, his growing sense of doom had finally overtaken his obedience. He had spent his career following orders, convincing himself that staying silent was the best way to survive. But survival wasn't enough anymore. He knew too much. He had to make a choice, stay complicit or take a stand. And he had made his decision. Vivian was already ahead. She had spent years navigating the underbelly of the legal system, knowing when to move and when to wait. Now was the time to move. She had the public's attention, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. The people who thought they could silence her had underestimated her reach. The judiciary was watching, the media was circling, and she had just been handed the final piece she needed. The battle was no longer just about her, it was about justice itself. Terrell had no illusions. He was in danger, and he knew it. The leak had revealed too much, and now he was in the crosshairs. He moved with purpose, switching vehicles, changing routes, making sure he wasn't being followed. But no matter how careful he was, the feeling of being watched never faded. He had the evidence, but evidence meant nothing if he didn't live long enough to use it. He needed a platform. He needed to go public before they made their move. The protests had reached a fever pitch. The police had escalated their response, and the streets were turning into battlegrounds. Tear gas filled the air, rubber bullets rained down. But the people weren't backing down. The harder the authorities pushed, the stronger the resistance became. The mayor had called for order, but there was no order left, only sides. And everyone was choosing one. Inside a boardroom, powerful men and women watched in silence. They had contingency plans for situations like this, but none of them had expected it to spiral this far. The usual tricks weren't working. The narrative wasn't shifting. They needed to make a statement, a show of force. One of them finally spoke. "It's time to end this." Hayes had made his decision. He wasn't going to run. He was going to burn it all down. If they were coming for him, he would make sure he wasn't the only one to fall. He pulled up his files, years of dirt on the department, on city officials, on everyone who had ever used him as their enforcer. He pressed send. Jenkins walked into internal affairs, hands shaking but his voice steady. He laid it all out, every falsified report, every illegal raid, every fabricated charge. He knew what this meant. He knew there was no coming back from this. But for the first time in his career, he felt free. Vivian stepped onto the stage, cameras flashing, microphones waiting. She had one shot to make this count. The truth was on her side. The world was watching. Terrell hit publish. The story was live. And the war was just beginning. Hayes had lost control. The files he had sent were spreading like wildfire. News stations were running exposés. Social media was in a frenzy, and his name was on every headline. The department officially disowned him, calling him a rogue element, an officer who had acted alone. He laughed bitterly at the irony. For years, he had been their tool, their weapon, and now they wanted to erase him. But he had one last move left. He wasn't going to disappear quietly. Jenkins watched the fallout from inside internal affairs. His confession had sparked an internal investigation that no one could contain. Officers were being pulled in for questioning. some already resigning before their names went public. He had feared retaliation, but something unexpected happened. Others started coming forward. Officers who had stayed silent, business owners who had been harassed, even politicians who had seen too much. The truth was no longer controlled. It was unraveling. Vivian stood in front of the judiciary, the weight of history pressing down on her. She had spent her life fighting within the system, but now she saw it for what it was: corrupt, self-preserving, built to protect itself. This was her moment. She laid out every detail, every illegal operation, every abuse of power. They had expected her to back down. Instead, she declared war. Terrell's story had gone global. Every outlet picked it up. Investigative journalists expanded on his findings, tracing the corruption back decades. He had uncovered a machine of oppression, and now the machine was breaking. But exposure came with a price. He received threats. His apartment was ransacked. He knew the people he had exposed wouldn't go down without a fight. But he had come too far to stop now. The city was in chaos. Protests turned into full-scale demonstrations. The police were no longer just facing activists, they were facing the public. The mayor's office scrambled for control, but it was slipping. Resignations started rolling in. Lawsuits were filed. The chain of command was crumbling, and the people who had orchestrated everything from the shadows were being dragged into the light. Inside a luxury penthouse, the real power players sat in silence. Their world was collapsing. They had weathered scandals before, but this was different. They debated their options. One of them suggested an exit strategy, another spoke of damage control. But none of them had a solution. The foundation they had built was no longer stable. And then, a call came in. One of their most loyal enforcers had flipped. They had been betrayed from within. Hayes made his final move. He went on live television, unfiltered, unscripted. He named names, exposed deals, laid everything bare. He knew it wouldn't save him, but it would bring them all down with him. The backlash was immediate. The department collapsed under scrutiny. Officials were arrested. The judiciary, now emboldened by Vivian's stand, launched an independent review. The machine had been dismantled. Jenkins walked away from it all, knowing he would never wear a badge again. But for the first time, he felt like he had done something that mattered. Vivian watched from her office as the system she had spent her life upholding finally faced its reckoning. Terrell, still looking over his shoulder, prepared for the next fight. Because he knew this wasn't over. Corruption never truly dies, it only hides, waiting for the next opportunity. The war had been won, but the battle would never end.